Lee Correctional Institution did not explode into violence by accident. Long before blood was spilled on its concrete floors, the prison was already failing in quieter, more dangerous ways. Located in rural South Carolina, Lee was built to warehouse the state's most violent offenders, men serving long sentences, life without parole, or stacked convictions that ensured they would never leave. The prison was maximum security in name, but inside, control was fragile, thin, and often imaginary. The housing unit where the stabbing would later occur was a pressure chamber. 2 tiers of cells stacked vertically. Rust-stained railings. Flickering fluorescent lights that never fully turned off. The smell of sweat, mildew, and disinfectant permanently soaked into the walls. Every surface bore the scars of long-term confinement, scratches on metal doors, chipped concrete, dark stains no amount of cleaning ever removed. In this unit, inmates lived inches apart, yet completely isolated. By the time the morning began, tension had already reached a dangerous level. Rival groups occupied opposite sides of the tier, separated not by walls, but by informal boundaries everyone understood. Crossing those lines without permission was an invitation to violence. Respect was enforced, not requested. Weakness was hunted. Guards knew the unit was unstable. Staffing shortages meant fewer officers watching more men. Radios crackled constantly with partial updates and unanswered calls. Doors that should have remained secured were opened longer than policy allowed. Every shortcut taken by administration compounded the risk. Inside the unit, inmates sensed it. The men moved differently that day, slower, more deliberate. Conversations were short and hushed. Eyes tracked movement from cell to cell. Muscles stayed tight, bodies coiled. In prison, violence announces itself through silence before it ever arrives through sound. The inmate who would later be stabbed was already awake. Like most men in the unit, he had learned not to sleep deeply. Sleep made you vulnerable. He sat on the edge of his bunk, shoulders tense, tattoos stretching across his forearms, ink earned over years, not decoration. His face was hardened, worn by stress and time, the look of someone who had adapted to prison life by surviving it. He was not a leader. He was not famous. He was not protected. That made him expendable. As the unit moved into its daily routine, doors opened in sequence. Metal groaned against metal. Boots echoed. Inmates stepped into the common area, some stretching, others pacing, a few pretending everything was normal. But nothing about Lee Correctional Institution was normal anymore. The power inside the unit did not belong to the guards. It belonged to the inmates who controlled access, favors, and fear. Groups formed quietly, bound by race, sentence length, and reputation. Debts were tracked mentally. Insults were never forgotten. Violence was not random, it was scheduled by circumstance. The victim walked the tier carefully, aware of where he did and did not belong. His posture stayed guarded. His jaw clenched. He avoided eye contact where possible, but not so much that it looked like fear. In prison, the smallest miscalculation could be fatal. Guards observed from a distance, separated by bars, policy, and understaffing. They could see movement, but not intent. They could hear noise, but not meaning. By the time violence became obvious, it was often already too late. The unit grew louder as the morning progressed. Voices overlapped. Tension thickened. Somewhere behind the noise, decisions were being finalized, silent agreements, quick nods, a look held half a second too long. The inmate never saw it coming. In Lee Correctional Institution, violence rarely came with warning. There was no argument, no dramatic escalation. Just proximity, opportunity, and a weapon fashioned from necessity, metal sharpened into purpose. As the countdown moved closer to 0, the prison itself seemed to hold its breath. Concrete walls absorbed every sound. Surveillance cameras stared without understanding. The institution functioned as designed, to contain bodies, not prevent brutality. By the time guards would realize control had been lost, the housing unit would already be transformed into a crime scene. And one man, unimportant to the system, unforgettable to the unit, would be bleeding on the floor of a prison that had stopped protecting anyone long before the first blow was struck. Inside Lee Correctional Institution, power did not flow from the guard towers or the administration offices. It flowed from the housing units themselves, specifically, from men who had learned how to control space, fear, and reputation within a system stretched far beyond its limits. The housing unit where the stabbing would occur operated under an unspoken hierarchy. It was never written down. Never officially acknowledged. But every inmate understood it the moment they arrived. Control belonged to those who could enforce consequences without attracting attention, those who could move violence quietly, efficiently, and without hesitation. This unit was divided long before that day began. Inmates aligned themselves by race, geography, and sentence length. These were not ideological choices. They were survival decisions. Neutrality was rare and dangerous. Association provided protection, but it also created obligation. If someone in your group was challenged, you were expected to respond. Failure to do so marked you as weak, and weakness did not last long inside Lee. The men who dominated the tier did not announce themselves. They did not posture unnecessarily. Their authority came from history, prior assaults, previous lockdowns, whispered stories that traveled from cell to cell faster than any official report. Reputation here was cumulative. One act of violence echoed for years. The inmate who would later be stabbed existed on the margins of this structure. He was not new, but he was not powerful. He did not command a group. He did not enforce rules. He kept his head down, paid his debts, and avoided unnecessary conflict. In a functioning prison, that might have been enough. At Lee, it made him vulnerable. Because vulnerability attracted attention. Several inmates in the unit had been watching him for weeks. Not constantly. Not obviously. Just enough to know his habits. When he woke up. Where he stood during count. Who he spoke to. Who he avoided. Prison intelligence was built through observation, not interrogation. And they noticed something else. He did not have protection. The guards, overwhelmed and understaffed, could not see this dynamic clearly. From their perspective, the unit was noisy but manageable. There were no immediate fights. No alarms. No open defiance. That was often how the most dangerous situations appeared, quiet enough to be ignored. But inside the unit, conversations were shifting. Low voices passed through the tier during moments when guards were distracted. A sentence here. A glance there. No one spoke directly about violence. That would have been careless. Instead, they spoke in implication, about respect, about unresolved issues, about who did and did not belong in certain areas. The victim began to sense the shift, though he could not fully define it. He noticed fewer acknowledgments when he walked the tier. Conversations stopped when he approached. The space around him felt subtly altered, as if the unit itself was pushing back. In prison, that sensation was familiar to men who had seen violence coming but could do nothing to stop it. He adjusted his behavior instinctively. He stayed closer to the walls. Limited his movement. Reduced his interactions. But those adjustments were interpreted not as caution, but as confirmation. In a place governed by perception, every change was read as signal. Meanwhile, the men who controlled the tier were making calculations. They weighed risk against opportunity. Guards were stretched thin. Doors were opened longer than policy allowed. Surveillance cameras existed, but blind spots were well known. Timing mattered. Location mattered even more. The housing unit's common area, where inmates congregated during movement, offered proximity. Too much proximity. Bodies crowded together. Noise masking intent. It was the kind of environment where a sudden act could unfold before anyone fully understood what was happening. That was where power could be asserted. The decision did not come from a single person. It rarely did. Violence in prison was collaborative, even when only one person carried it out. Approval was silent but collective. No objections were raised. No warnings issued. The victim was marked, not officially, not verbally, but effectively. Guards continued their routine, unaware of how close the unit was to collapse. They saw men standing, talking, pacing. They did not see the hierarchy shifting beneath those movements. They did not hear the meaning behind the noise. As the morning wore on, the air inside the unit grew heavier. The inmate could feel it in his chest. A pressure that had nothing to do with the building itself. He avoided eye contact, but not entirely. He knew better than to appear afraid. Fear invited challenge. But confidence required backing, and he had none. The men watching him knew this. They had seen the same pattern play out before. The unit would explode, then lock down. Reports would be written. Names would be filed away. And the cycle would continue. Violence was not an aberration here, it was part of the system's rhythm. The guards' radios crackled intermittently. Movement schedules were adjusted. Count times shifted. Each minor deviation created opportunity. The inmates who understood this best were already positioning themselves. The victim stood near the edge of the common area, close enough to observe, far enough to retreat if necessary. His posture was tense. His hands stayed visible. He tried to appear occupied, uninterested. It did not matter. The hierarchy had already decided where he stood. In Lee Correctional Institution, survival depended not on innocence or guilt, but on leverage. On alliances. On fear. And on that morning, inside that housing unit, one man had none of those things left. The tier continued to hum with activity, oblivious on the surface. But underneath, the lines had been drawn. The roles assigned. The moment was approaching when silence would break, and the power structure would enforce itself the only way it knew how. By the time the guards would react, the unit would already be irrevocably changed. And the inmate, isolated, exposed, and outnumbered was running out of time. The moment violence finally surfaced inside the housing unit at Lee Correctional Institution, it did not erupt suddenly. It unfolded with a quiet inevitability, the kind that only exists in places where control has already slipped away long before the first strike. By late morning, the unit was fully active. Inmates occupied the common area in loose formations, some standing near railings, others pacing short, repetitive paths along the concrete floor. The noise level was steady but unremarkable. Voices overlapped. Metal clanged. Boots scraped against the ground. To an untrained observer, it looked like routine movement. But inside the unit, timing was being measured precisely. The guards were positioned at a distance, separated by bars and policy. Staffing shortages meant attention was divided. Radios crackled intermittently, drawing eyes away from the tier for seconds at a time. Doors remained open slightly longer than regulations allowed. Each delay widened the window. The inmate stood near the edge of the common area, just as he had earlier. His posture remained guarded. He had positioned himself near a wall, not for comfort, but for awareness. It limited his blind spots. It gave him a fraction of control. What he did not see was how close the threat had already moved. Two inmates shifted their positions subtly. No sudden movements. No obvious signals. One stepped closer to the center of the unit. Another angled his body, creating a visual barrier between the victim and the guard's line of sight. In prison, coordination often looked accidental to those who did not understand it. The unit's surveillance cameras continued recording, but their coverage was imperfect. Years of familiarity had taught inmates exactly where the blind spots existed, areas where angles overlapped poorly, where bodies could block views, where moments disappeared into shadow. The first contact was not dramatic. There was no shouted warning. No argument. No escalation. One moment the inmate was standing alone. The next, someone was too close. Personal space vanished. A shoulder brushed past him. He turned instinctively, confused for half a second. That half second was enough. The weapon was already in motion. Fashioned from scavenged metal, sharpened by repetition and patience, it was small enough to be concealed, large enough to do damage. In prison, such tools were not rare. What made them dangerous was not their size, but their purpose. The initial strike landed quickly, aimed low and close. There was no swing, no flourish, just a direct, practiced movement. The inmate recoiled, more from shock than pain, stumbling backward into the narrow space between bodies. Noise spiked instantly. Voices rose. Someone shouted. Others moved away instinctively, creating space without understanding why. In those first seconds, confusion dominated the unit. Guards looked up, trying to locate the source of the disturbance. The second strike came faster. The inmate attempted to retreat, but the crowd worked against him. Bodies pressed in from all sides. Movement became restricted. The concrete floor offered no traction as his footing slipped. He reached out reflexively, grabbing at nothing. The guards began shouting commands, their voices competing with the noise of the unit. Radios were raised. Calls were made. But distance mattered. By the time officers began moving toward the disturbance, the assault was already underway. The attacker stayed close. No wasted motion. No hesitation. The goal was not intimidation, it was finality. The inmate collapsed to his knees, the impact absorbed by the concrete beneath him. In prison, that position was catastrophic. It limited vision. It limited movement. It erased any remaining ability to escape. Several inmates stepped back, not out of concern, but calculation. Proximity now carried risk. Cameras were still recording. Guards were closing in. The window was narrowing. The final moments unfolded in less than a minute. The attacker withdrew as suddenly as he had advanced, blending into the shifting mass of bodies. The weapon disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, passed off or concealed, its purpose fulfilled. The inmate fell forward, his body striking the floor with a dull, final sound. Silence followed, not complete, but altered. The noise in the unit changed character. Panic replaced tension. Shouts became frantic. Inmates backed away instinctively, creating a rough circle around the body on the ground. No one moved to help. In prison, involvement carried consequences. Guards arrived seconds later, their presence abrupt and forceful. Commands were shouted repeatedly. Batons were raised. Inmates were ordered to the ground, hands visible, faces down. Compliance was uneven but increasing. The reality of the situation had finally reached everyone at once. Medical staff were called, but the delay was unavoidable. Security had to be reasserted before aid could be rendered. The inmate remained motionless on the floor as officers secured the area, their boots moving carefully around him. The assault had lasted less than 6 minutes. 6 minutes inside a blind spot, fueled by hierarchy, neglect, and opportunity. By the time the unit was fully under control, the outcome was already clear. The inmate showed no signs of recovery. What had been a routine morning had transformed into a homicide scene inside one of South Carolina's most dangerous prisons. As restraints were applied and inmates were escorted back toward their cells, the weight of what had happened settled in. Not as shock, but as recognition. For many, this was not unexpected. It was simply the next chapter in a cycle that had been repeating for years. The housing unit fell quiet again, but it was not the quiet of order. It was the quiet that followed inevitability. The moment the inmate's body hit the concrete floor, Lee Correctional Institution shifted from controlled neglect into full emergency mode. Red lights flashed above the housing unit doors. Alarms echoed through corridors that had already seen too much violence. Officers flooded the tier in numbers rarely seen during normal operations, their presence sudden, aggressive, and overdue. Commands were barked repeatedly, "Get down," hands visible, faces to the floor, until the chaos collapsed into forced compliance. The housing unit was locked down within minutes. Cell doors slammed shut one by one, metal striking metal with a finality that carried through the building. Inmates were ordered inside without explanation. Some complied immediately. Others hesitated, staring at the spot on the floor where the inmate had fallen, trying to calculate what this death would mean for them. Inside the sealed unit, fear spread quietly. Men sat on bunks, backs against cold concrete walls, replaying the last few minutes in their minds. Everyone understood the rules now. Someone had crossed a line. Someone had enforced power. And now the consequences would ripple outward: searches, interrogations, retaliation, transfers. Medical staff arrived late, escorted by armed officers. There was no urgency in their movement. Experience had taught them what violence inside Lee usually meant. The inmate was pronounced dead inside the unit, his body covered and removed without ceremony. To the institution, he became a report number. To the unit, he became a warning. The guards began extraction procedures almost immediately. Suspected participants were identified not by evidence alone, but by reputation, proximity, and inmate intelligence quietly shared with officers looking for control. Shackles clicked shut. Names were called. Men were removed from cells and escorted down the tier under heavy guard. The attacker, or attackers, did not resist. In Lee Correctional Institution, resistance after the fact served no purpose. The act was already complete. The message had already been delivered. Search teams swept the housing unit methodically. Mattresses were cut open. Toilets were dismantled. Personal property was dumped onto floors and inspected piece by piece. Weapons were expected. Whether they were found mattered less than restoring the illusion of authority. The prison administration issued statements hours later. They spoke of an isolated incident. They spoke of ongoing investigations. They spoke of staff safety protocols. Inside the prison, no one believed them. Inmates knew the truth. This was not an isolated act. It was the predictable outcome of overcrowding, understaffing, and a system that allowed inmate hierarchies to replace institutional control. The stabbing was not a failure of one moment, it was the result of years of neglect. The housing unit remained locked down for days. Meals were delivered cold through slots in the doors. Movement was eliminated. Communication was reduced to shouted conversations through concrete walls. Tension simmered, unresolved. Everyone waited to see what consequences would actually stick, and which would fade away like so many before. Eventually, the routine resumed. It always did. The men responsible were transferred or isolated. Paperwork was filed. Cameras were reviewed. Administrators moved on. But the unit itself remained unchanged. Same walls. Same blind spots. Same hierarchy, quietly reasserting itself once the pressure eased. The inmate who died would not be remembered beyond the prison's internal records. No press conference would speak his name. No memorial would mark the spot where he fell. His death would join a list of others, statistics absorbed into annual reports and forgotten by everyone except those who witnessed it. But inside that housing unit, the impact lingered. Inmates moved differently after the lockdown lifted. Trust eroded further. Silence deepened. The knowledge that violence could erupt without warning, without resistance, without consequence, settled into the bones of the place. Lee Correctional Institution continued to operate. But something had been reinforced, something darker than policy or protocol. The truth that inside these walls, survival was never guaranteed. That control was always temporary. And that when the system failed, the inmates would enforce their own order, one body at a time.